Welcome back to the Exchange Server 2016 Mailbox Databases course. This module will cover backups, recovery, and restores. So, backups, really important. Somebody once told me that the 11th commandment is thou shalt do backups.
Well, that might have been important, but not
Yes.
anymore in 2013. It's not, or 2016 rather, it's not quite as important.
Yeah, so that's actually a really important point, is that if you can avoid that destination where you're going into a disaster, if you have all these redundant ways of saying, one day in the future, I'm going to have a disaster and I need to restore a backup, or I need to do something to get back to a state where everything is working, then you will be in a good shape. So there's many things that you can do in Exchange to prevent that day where you have a disaster. But the one thing that you need to first consider is what are the data loss scenarios that's possible.
Yeah. Could be losing an item,
Yes.
A lost mailbox, a lost server, lost database.
There's many things that can go wrong. You know, at the end of the day, if somebody loses an important email, then that could be the end of the world for that person, because it was a really important mail. It was that deal that he waited for with the contract or something like that. So losing a small individual email could be the end of the world for somebody. So major disaster.
Right. But there's so many things in Exchange 2016, a lot of which that were introduced in 2013, that preclude you from, or rather would mitigate those scenarios from happening. I mean, you could actually utilize things like in-place hold, e-discovery, archiving, single item recovery. You know, some of these things you have to enable or configure ahead of time. But if you do your planning like you're supposed to, and know about these things in advance, and implement a database availability group and site resiliency, the days, again, going back to how we introduced this, was you really don't have to back up and restore items like you did in the old days.
Yeah.
But that said, there are scenarios where you might have to do just that too.
Yeah. So when you plan this well and you implemented something like single item recovery, and you don't have to go to a backup, because every time you go to a backup, that's time. That is, it's going to take time to go and fetch that backup. Maybe the backup is off-site. You have to phone somebody to bring the backup on-site. Then you have to put it in a server or in a machine that can mount that tape, restore that information. It takes a lot of time. And so the time before the person gets that deal, maybe you can just ask the person that sent the email to send it again. That could be quicker. Maybe he doesn't want to, because that's embarrassing to ask somebody to send an important email again, but you know, sometimes you have to do that to recover the day. But there's mechanisms in Exchange like the single item recovery, which if after you've deleted a mail item and when you have things enabled like legal hold, it's still actually in Exchange. It's not gone. Exchange hides it from the user. It's not in his deleted items anymore, but it's in his recoverable items. And if he goes to his recoverable items, he can go and restore that item himself. So, and you can configure the time delay that you want to set on the database to keep items in that recoverable item so that he can undelete things. So maybe in your organization, you want to keep that for a long time. So maybe up to a year. That's got a consequence on database sizes and so on. So you need to think about that. But maybe you want to keep it for a few weeks or something. And then that allows people to say, oops, I accidentally deleted something. I want to undelete that mail item and get that again.
But if you can't do that, because if, like you said, there's size, it's going to impact the size of the database or the mailbox, and let's say you don't want to use e-discovery or in-place hold rather for data recovery.
Yeah.
Excuse me, those instances where you were talking about item retention, if an item is deleted because it's gone beyond the item retention period, that might be a time where you have to rely on a backup and restore from a backup. Yeah. Or if you're not using a DAG and you lose one of the databases, then that's another example of when you would want to use backup and recovery. Yeah. But still, why don't we chat about Exchange, the Exchange native data protection, which is something that is a concept of, and a bundle of features built into Exchange that mitigates the need for that.
Yeah, so Exchange native data protection is really a collection of features that you have to implement all of those and not just some of them, because then if you don't implement all of those features, you're not going to cover all your bases. So because there will still be scenarios that can happen to you if you haven't covered all of your bases. So think about Exchange native data protection as a collection of things that you implement in your Exchange system so that you can avoid that disaster. So the first thing that's part of this Exchange native data protection is the database availability group. Because you introduce redundancy, you have database availability groups, and you have the ability to replicate databases from one server to another server. And if something happens to a server, the storage, the hardware, anything like that, you fail over to another server. That other server is an independent unit. So the one server doesn't impact the other server. And so with database availability groups, you can replicate databases. And we recommend that you have at least 3 copies of your databases, because one copy, if one copy is down and then you're down to 2 other copies, if something else happens, then you might start losing data. So you have to make sure that you have at least 3 copies of your data. So that's one of the things that you need to implement with Exchange native data protection.
And one of those copies should be a lagged database copy as well, which is another feature of Exchange native data protection.
To protect you from even more scenarios, like the ones that we mentioned previously, like logical corruption or a rogue administrator that, you just fired somebody and he said, I'll show you, I'm going to delete some databases. If you have a lag copy in another data center and he didn't, touch them, then you still have the ability to go back to the point before he did the damage, and you can then mount a database to a previous point in time. So that's another component, another base that you have to protect with Exchange native data protection. You also have to implement the single item recovery settings properly to say, this will suit my setting. That's I need to provide the ability for people to undelete emails up to a month or something like that. And if somebody wants more than a month, then I need to confidently tell them that I'm not doing backups because I have Exchange native data protection. So I wouldn't be able to recover anything that's older than a month if you've configured your settings to be a month. If you want it to be 3 months, then you have to implement the setting to be 3 months. So that's another protection that you have to build in.
Right. And then finally, you have the ability to enable archive mailboxes, archive and retention policies, in-place holds, and in-place hold and e-discovery for large mailboxes.
Yeah. So if you implemented all of those features, then you might be in a good place. Also considering all the disasters that you want to cater for, maybe a site resilient DAG as well, you might be in a place where you have no need for backups. That anything that can go wrong in your environment, whether it's a mail item that is lost, a database that is lost, a server that is lost, a data center that is lost, anything that goes wrong in your environment, you have a solution that doesn't require a backup. And that is Exchange native data protection. So if you're in that place, then you can say, well, I'm not going to buy a backup solution anymore. I'm not going to buy backup software, backup tapes, and all of that I need to maintain. I have a solution for everything that I think that can go wrong. And if it goes wrong, then I will recover using the native features inside of Exchange, and I don't have to go back to backups. But if you don't have that features, and maybe you don't want to implement DAGs or so on, maybe you're a small company, then you can still do backups. The backups is still a supported mechanisms in Exchange. We need you to have volume shadow copy services backup. So Exchange 2016 doesn't support streaming backups. The streaming backup API is no longer available in Exchange, and so you need to have VSS backups. VSS backups do allow you to backup active copies as well as passive copies. The built-in VSS backup of Windows Server doesn't back up passive copies, but other vendors that support VSS backups do allow you to back up passive copies. But your backup solution needs to be VSS compliant. It cannot be the old streaming backup. So it's best people make sure that Exchange is that the backup solution that they use supports Exchange Server 2016 directly. Look for it on the box. It must say, now with Exchange 2016 support. You don't want to assume that it works and then one day when you want to restore a backup, then find out that it wasn't supported all this time, because if you phone the support people of that software and they tell you, well, you didn't upgrade to the latest version, sorry for you, then it's sad. You won't be able to back up. The nice thing is there's a lot of software out there that can do backups, and people have their favorites, and a lot of organizations where they have to do backups of other applications and other systems, their backup software could be part of a centralized backup solution that will back up their SharePoint and their SQL databases and their Active Directory and maybe even Windows desktops and so on. You may have this vast enterprise solution, and Exchange is just one part of it. Exchange is just another thing that you plug in there, and it backs up Exchange as well. So many options for backup software as well. For backup media, you also have many options. Some people prefer technologies where you back up first to disk. That could be pretty fast. So you back up your databases to another disk into a backup disk, and then that is lifted to tape. Maybe it backs it up to tape directly, and then the tape can be taken offline. And that's a nice thing about tapes, is they are highly portable. So you may have a courier company that would come and collect the tapes and then store them in a location that is far away from your data center. So in case there's a major disaster, that you do have the tapes for recovery. Some companies also have to do backups because there's a compliance reason. So they need to be able to say, okay, maybe there's a legal case and they need to get evidence of something that happened 7 years ago. Or depending on the industry, there's always some sort of requirement. For some industries, it's 5 years. Some industries, you have to keep information maybe for 25 years. So you have to sort of keep a tape to say, this is the state of affairs of 20 years ago. But you also have to consider, in 20 years' time, are you going to have the hardware to be able to physically
recover
that tape inside of the tape drive? Would it still be available? So
is it on floppy?
Yeah, maybe a floppy disk or something like that. One of those big 8-inch floppy disks. There's lots of options with backup media as well, but you have to sort of think about the future as well. And when you look 5 years ahead or 10 years ahead, maybe even, most technologies are still around. You would be able to restore that. But beyond that, who knows? Technology is innovating so fast. There might be stuff that makes all of the previous technology redundant, and you might just decide to destroy that tape drive and chuck it, and then you've destroyed your whole recovery plan as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And your career.
And your career. But maybe it's not your problem in 20 years' time. You'll be retired. Yeah. Yeah. Living on the beach. Yeah. So when we want to do recoveries, there's a couple of things that you have to consider. So some of the things that you could do is you could recover a failed mailbox servers, and there's some options when you recover mailbox servers. You can recover just the configuration of the server, and this is where you do a setup on a server. You implement a new server and you tell it that you want to restore the server, and it will read the configuration from Active Directory and apply it to the server, and it will then be part of a server that will run that configuration again.
I assume that's done with a recovery switch.
Yeah, that's the recovery mode installation. So when you do a recovery mode installation. Or you could also recover just a database. Maybe there's something happened to one of the database, you would recover that data in a database. Another option is to use a recovery database. So maybe you've passed the single item recovery mechanism, and you can then go and create a recovery database on Exchange server, which is a sort of extra copy of another database. You restore to that other database, and you can then export information out of there to a PSD file and then give that mail to the user to say, you know, this was the mail that you received 3 months ago and you don't have it anymore and it's not in single item recovery.
I imagine that's useful also just for like individual mailbox recovery.
Yes. Yeah. So if you want to recover an individual mailbox, or you know, maybe there's a legal case and you need to recover a mailbox mailbox for a user that's no longer in your organization.
Right.
Yeah.
Although these days, again, I'm sure you want to use things like in-place hold and e-discovery for that.
Yeah. Another reason why you might want to do a recovery is to repair a database that is corrupt. Maybe something happened to the storage and there's a physical corruption or something like that, and you don't have a DAG. Remember, if you have a DAG, then that wouldn't be a problem because you just fail over to another server. But if you have a DAG, if you don't have a DAG, then you have to restore that database to another server. You have to replace maybe the storage that made it corrupt, and then you would restore that database. Maybe you also want to recover public folder items, so that would be another option to recover public folder mailboxes so that you can recover the public folders or the items in there. And then another thing that sometimes is needed, especially if you don't have DAGs, is what we call dial tone recovery. And this is this concept where you know, you're in a disaster and you want to phone emergency services, and you then pick up the phone and you want to hear a dial tone. So, you know, everything is going wrong, but at least you can make a call. And so a dial tone recovery is the principle where you've had a disaster and you mount empty databases as quickly as possible. Maybe the storage got corrupted, and you just mount an empty database and give people the ability to send and receive mail. They don't have all the historical emails, but they can send and receive emails.
Can they see meeting requests or anything like that?
They can get new meeting requests and so on. They wouldn't be able to see their old calendars, but they would be able to do everything they do in Outlook, but they wouldn't be able to send, or they wouldn't be able to see historical information. But at least they are working. They can send mails and they can receive emails. And then so this is now available to your users, and then you start doing a restore in the background to a recovery database, and you restore to another location on the server. Maybe that will take a few hours and you need to do a few tests to make sure everything is fine. And then that evening, when everything is calmed down and so on, you swap the two databases and you make the recovered database, which got the historical information, the primary database, and then you make that empty database that's got a little bit of mail that people received that day, you make that the recovery database, and then you merge the data from the recovery database to the primary database. You don't want to do it the other way around because that is a lot of data, you know, all the historical email. So you swap the two around and you merge the small data that you generated that day back into the primary database. And then the next day people come to work and all their mail is back, the historical mail plus the mail from the previous day, and they can be happy and work again. So dial tone recovery is another option for some companies that don't implement database availability groups, and you have to give them a service as soon as possible so that they can send and receive emails. So that is another recovery mechanism that people in some organizations can still do or still want to do. So that wraps up our module on database recovery and mailbox databases. This also ends our course on Exchange Server 2016 mailbox databases. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned and look for our Exchange Server course on transport. And if you haven't done our Client Access Services course and our infrastructure course, we also recommend that you check those out. Thank you.